Dr. Matthew Nagra, thank you so very much for being here, my friend.
Thanks for having me on and thanks for the intro.
Let's go ahead and dive into those five myths. We've come up with five of the biggest for the purpose of this conversation today, even though I'm sure there are 25, even 50 of them that we could tackle. But let's go ahead and start with that big one. And that is that if you're eating a plant based diet, a vegan diet, there is no way in the world you're getting all the nutrients that you need.
Yeah, that one always gets me because it's so funny when we look at the research on different populations. We can look in Brazil, Switzerland, Finland, across the U.S. and Canada. When we actually compare nutrient intakes between vegans, vegetarians, meat eaters, we actually see that the vegans do as well, or if a lot of cases even better than the meat eaters do for overall nutrition. That's not to say that there aren't certain nutrients of focus. Yes, vegans should be taking a B12 supplement. Yes, here in Vancouver anyway, you should be taking a vitamin D supplement, and there may be a couple others to consider. But overall, we actually see that as far as nutrient intake goes, it's pretty good amongst the vegans. And it's a shame that we always think that you could be eating McDonald's every day and nobody really seems to bat an eye about deficiency when really we should maybe be worried about excess there. But when you start ditching the animal products and going more towards the plant-based side, the classic meme, everyone becomes a nutrition expert, right? They start asking you all the questions and, where are you going to get X, Y, Z? But overall, you're eating a variety of whole plant foods or minimally processed plant foods, and you're probably doing pretty well. Iron, which is something we're going to talk about more, is the number one nutrient deficiency in the world. It's certainly not a vegan specific problem. B12, especially in older populations, becomes a problem as well because you absorb less of it as you age. Vitamin D, again, living here in Vancouver, it's probably a problem for a lot more than just the vegans. So there are concerns amongst all populations, and no matter what diet you're eating, you want to ensure that you're getting your nutrition. It's not just the vegans, which is kind of the point that really annoys me about that question because it always seems to be directed at that specific population.
31% of the entire US population is at risk of having at least one vitamin deficiency. And so then you talk about the various diets, and no, 31% of the US population is not eating a plant based diet. Nowhere close to that. Ergo, a lot of people have a lot of room for improvement. And then if you go and you look at the global prevalence, you scroll down here and you see this other study. It says in some areas of the world, you're looking at up to 60 or 70% of the population having some sort of deficiency. So I think that that's really a key fact that often gets overlooked in this conversation. So I'm glad that you and I are able to bring that up today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and especially when we look at global prevalence too. I mean, there are other issues there. There's food security issues. There are these other factors that we have to consider too. It's not just about whether or not you're eating animal products.
No question about that. No question about that. Let's go on to another one. We'll go to myth number two here. You're more at risk to break your bones.
Yeah, this really popped off like 2 years ago now, 2019, when the Epic Oxford study came out, suggesting that vegans were at higher risk of fracture. And all of the Joe Rogans of the world, all the big names we're talking about, or the big names in the kind of like anti-vegan or vegan combaters, really started to run with it. And we have to look at the nuance within this study. There are a couple issues. For one, the Epic Oxford population, which is a UK-based population they were looking at, the vegans in that group tended to not always be the most health focused. There weren't super high rates of like B12 supplementation. If we look at data during the winter time anyways, the vegans dipped into deficiency for vitamin D. And when you look at a breakdown of men, premenopausal women, postmenopausal women, it was actually only the postmenopausal women that were at increased risk of fracture compared to the meat eaters. The vegan men weren't at risk compared to the non-vegan men, and the premenopausal women also were not. Another really big factor was that the vegans tended to weigh a lot less. Now, one of the biggest factors for fracture risk is weight. If you're light, especially underweight, your risk of fracture goes way up because you're not stressing your bones all the time. Your bones don't have a chance to really strengthen. And we had a lot of vegans under under a BMI of about 20, which is just on the bottom end of what would be considered a normal BMI or healthy BMI. Only look at people who are around the middle of the normal range to the higher end of the normal range and above. Vegans did not have a higher risk of fracture. So that tells us that BMI was actually, or the low BMI in the vegans was actually a driving force behind that. Now, that can be a good thing in certain ways, but not so good if you're underweight. And we can suspect, based on the number of vegans that were below that lower BMI cutoff, that we had a fair amount of them that were actually underweight and possibly significantly underweight. Now that's one big factor. Now, of course, calcium is something to discuss, protein intake. And these researchers, when they only looked at individuals with, at least I would say, a decent calcium intake, there was still a risk of fracture. It was less than if we didn't only look at those who were consuming more calcium, but there was still an increase in risk. Same with when you consider protein. Yes, higher protein intakes decreased risk a little bit, but there was still residual risk there. And I would suspect, based on everything I've just said, that it was the low BMI that was the main factor there. But we also have a study that came out just earlier this year from the Adventist cohort, so Adventist Health Study 2. And this one looked at vegans, vegetarians, we'll call them flexitarians, semi-vegetarians is what they named them, and meat eaters. And again, vegans had a higher risk, but it was only, again, the vegan peri-postmenopausal women. And when they supplemented both calcium and vitamin D, there was no increase in risk anymore. So the risk was only there for hip fracture and I believe total fracture for those who were not supplementing calcium or vitamin D, which does suggest to me that yes, we want to really make sure we're getting our good calcium sources, things like fortified plant milks, tofu, certain other foods like tahini, even broccoli can be a decent source, and so on. And we definitely want to make sure you're taking your vitamin D if you live in northern latitude.
All right, next up is protein. Where you get your protein, the quality of protein. How does a plant-based diet compare to the standard Western diet?
So there are a few factors to say the quality of protein. For one, we want to look at the amino acid content. One of the claims towards vegan diets or plant-based foods anyway is that they have a poor amino acid profile. And amino acids, for those of you who are not aware, are the building blocks of protein. You can think of them as the little Lego blocks that you stick together and you build a full structure, a protein out of it. Well, plant foods tend to have lower amounts of maybe one or two of the 9 essential amino acids, meaning the 9 amino acids that we need to eat in our diet. And so if you ate just that food and ate nothing else and just barely met your minimum protein requirement, you might actually not have gotten enough protein because you'd be lacking in that one amino acid or maybe 2 amino acids. Fortunately, we don't do that. We eat multiple foods. We eat a variety. You eat your beans, you eat your grains, you eat your nuts, seeds, veggies, fruits. And so all in all, over the course of a whole day, you shouldn't have to worry about it. It shouldn't be a concern at all if you're eating a variety of protein and eating enough overall protein. So that would be one. Actually, the one food that's food product that's completely missing one of the essential amino acids is collagen or gelatin, which is an animal product. So I like to throw that one in there. Now, with digestibility being the other concern, so some proponents of animal protein will say that plant protein isn't as digestible. You don't absorb as much of it when you eat it. They will base that on 2 scales. One is called the PDCAST, Protein Digestibility Corrected Amino Acid Score, but I'll call it PDCAST. And the other one is the Digestible Indispensable Amino Acid Score, or I'll call it the DIAS for short. But a lot of issues there. What we need to look at is actual human data. And the limited amount of human data that we have, looking at digestion, again, from mouth to end of small intestine, usually through ileostomy bags, we see that there is maybe a few percent difference at most. It's absolutely tiny difference between the digestibility of either animal or plant protein sources. But what really matters is, does it lead to similar muscle growth or strength gains? who cares about the amino acid profile differences or digestibility differences and all of that if the result is the same, right? That's what we should care about. And we do have research on that. We have a lot of research comparing whey protein, pea protein, even some on rice protein to whey protein, which is considered the highest quality of a lot of the animal proteins. And we consistently see if you're having the same amount of protein and a high quality protein at that, there's very little, or actually there's no measurable difference between the different sources. So the plant sources perform just as well as the animal sources. And some might see that and say, well, those are supplements. They're isolated. They're more digestible. How can we say that that's relevant to overall foods if you're having a vegan diet versus a omnivorous diet? Well, a study published early this year, early 2021, actually hopefully puts that to rest. They took 19 vegans and 19 meat eaters. These are all men. They had them up their protein intake, either from plant sources by supplementing a soy protein on top of their diet, or in the animal group or the omnivore group, whey protein, so that they were having 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. That's kind of where you don't see further benefit for strength gains. And after 12 weeks of training, resistance training, no difference, no statistically significant difference between the different groups. So that should tell us that in a diet where most of your protein intake is coming from either exclusively plant foods or a mix of plant and animal foods with, yes, a bit of supplementation in there. If there's no difference there, I don't suspect we will see a difference. And I don't suspect we should think that there's a difference.
So let's move on and put the focus for number 4 here on our vegan myth list. Iron. If you're eating exclusively plants, you're not going to be able to get enough iron, because where does iron come from? Well, it comes from meat, it comes from liver, it comes from animal products.
So if we look at developed countries, we actually don't typically see a difference in iron deficiency rates amongst, say, vegans, vegetarians, or meat eaters. They tend to be really similar, and there's a few reasons for that. So for one, if you eat plant-based iron or non-heme iron with vitamin C, which, bell peppers, broccoli, citrus fruits, you can actually really increase the absorption of that iron. Also, if your iron stores are low, you boost your absorption of non-heme iron or plant iron. If your stores are topped up where they should be, then you decrease absorption, so you really regulate that. So if you're on the low end and you add vitamin C to the mix, you can boost your absorption to roughly around what you get with heme iron from animal products anyway. The nice thing is it prevents you, in a lot of cases, from getting too high with your iron intake, which can also be, or your iron status, I should say, which can also be a negative and increase your risk of certain diseases. Now, heme iron that you get from animal products, sure, it's very consistently absorbed. It has a pretty narrow range of the percentage that's absorbed, but it's also associated with an increased risk of several diseases, such as type 2 diabetes, certain cancers, even cardiovascular disease. So it's not something we want to be getting too much of in our diet, or in a lot of cases, like we do, we can have zero and just focus on the plant sources. Of course, if you are deficient in iron, especially if you're anemic, then yeah, supplementation could be a great strategy for boosting values as well. There's nothing wrong with that. Like I said, iron is the #1 nutrient deficiency in the world. And I think a lot of people could benefit from that. But it's not something that we need to necessarily worry about unless it is a problem, which you can find out with blood testing, how you're feeling, are you fatigued, and so on. But I would not think at all that it is a vegan specific problem. But if you look at data in, say, developing nations, you will sometimes see that those eating like vegetarian diets might be at higher risk than those eating omnivorous diets. But that largely has to do with overall diet quality, not just because you're plant-based per se.
All right. And last but not least, soy. It's like one of the least healthy things you can eat in the entire world. What is the truth about soy?
Yeah, so soy gets a bad rap because it contains isoflavones. These are compounds. They're also known as phytoestrogens, and I think that's the word that gets people, right? Phytoestrogen, thinking it's estrogen, going to act like estrogen. And these phytoestrogens are about a 1/1000th the strength of our own body's estrogens, but they mimic estrogen in structure in certain ways, so they can bind to some of the same receptors. Now, with that, some people think, oh, it's going to promote my breast cancer, or it's going to promote breast cancer because it's going to bind to the receptors in the breast tissue and wreak havoc. But that's not really how it works. These, as I mentioned, phytoestrogens are very weak compared to our own estrogens, and they also bind to specific receptors. They actually select for specific receptors that can have different impacts in different parts of the body. So in breast tissue, for example, these beta receptors, they can actually have anti-estrogenic effects. So it can actually do the opposite of estrogen in the breast tissue. In bone tissue, it actually promotes an estrogenic response, which is a good thing as well for bone mineral density in postmenopausal women, especially. And there is some research on soy consumption and fracture risk, seeing that it does reduce fracture risk. So from a purely estrogenic standpoint, the kind of physiology of what's happening is just completely misunderstood. Now, we also have some rodent studies, which again doesn't translate to humans, showing that the concentrations of phytoestrogens in their blood can ramp up by just absurd amounts when they consume these phytoestrogens. But when humans do it, the blood levels or tissue levels don't increase very much. So again, very different responses between animals and humans. And most importantly, we have many randomized controlled trials. In fact, we have meta-analyses of randomized controlled trials on soy and soy phytoestrogen consumption and its effect on either estrogen or testosterone levels in both men and women. And we don't see that it alters values. So that should be the end of the story as far as the estrogen response goes, or the feminizing effects in men that is commonly claimed.
Hi, I'm the weight loss champion, Chuck Carroll. Thank you so very much for checking out the Exam Room podcast by the Physicians Committee here on Plant Based News. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcast or Spotify. Just click the links below to raise your health IQ.